Hello, everyone. This is Marcelin, and I have the good pleasure of having a conversation with Ruth Evon Idahosa. She is the founder and executive director of Pathfinders Justice Initiative. It is an international organization for the prevention of sex slavery and sexual violence. This foundation works for the liberation of enslaved women and girls. The organization is registered in Nigeria, but they also have offices in New York. Thank you very much for responding to the call.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor.
First of all, let me thank you very much for the work that you are doing, fighting for women and girls and rescuing them from sex traffic and sex slavery. This is such a noble work that you are doing. And as an African, as a Pan-Africanist, I can't be happier to see or to chat with somebody who is doing this important fight. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Grateful.
So my first question that I would like to ask you is, how did you get into this line of work? How did you develop that passion to go and fight?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've always, even as a child, I've always had this, strong drive for justice. So everything from, fighting for, children, other, classmates, to, standing up for my sisters in situations where, they weren't in a position to be able to do that for themselves. So I really grew up with this sense of what I refer to as stretching tight shoes, because I give the example of, when I was young as a child, my mother would trace our feet on pieces of paper before she was traveling to the US or to England. And she would take those pieces of paper to a shoe store and then, try to estimate our shoe sizes and bring the shoes back, to Nigeria. And sometimes the shoes would work, sometimes the shoes, would be too tight, or sometimes they would be too big. But in most of the time, they were always too small. And so I would, in the instances where my sister's shoes were too small, I would, I would wear her shoes for a couple of days to be able to stretch them out, to give her more space. And so that I realized that symbolically that became a theme in my life, where I found myself always seeing the world as God originally intended for justice to look like, right? So as a visionary, I tend not to see the reality of what is. I tend to see what the original intention was. And so I think that has been a consistent theme in the way that I view the world and the way that I show up in the world. And at some point, I became a lawyer, and I started practicing law at a law firm in New York, where I became a partner. And I think for a Black woman in America, this was the epitome of financial success, right? You have the corner office, you have other lawyers that you're supervising. And I felt that there was always this longing for something greater, something bigger. And, my definition of success was not what I was currently experiencing. It really was more based on significance, and ensuring that I did not leave the world in the same state that I met it. And so there was a weekend where I was reading this book called Let Your Life Speak, a book by Parker Palmer. And there was a line in a poem that said, this was in October of 2013, that said, ask me whether what I've done is my life. And I just kept thinking about that. And even though I was doing things here and there to support the work in Nigeria and across other parts of Africa, I just knew that this was what I was currently doing was not what my life had been beckoning for me to do. And so that was on a Friday night. Monday, I walked into my senior partner's office. I handed him my resignation letter. And I said, look, I'm going to go do what my life has been calling for me to do. And so I resigned from my partnership, and I had no idea what I was going to do. My late father is Archbishop Benson-Idahosa, and he nicknamed me Pathfinder. That name, when I started thinking, okay, what am I going to do in this organization? I know I'm going to work with women and girls, but exactly what do I do? I think that was one of the first things that came to mind, was that you're a Pathfinder. It's not only prophetically what he called me, but it's also what my life work was intended to be, really helping women and girls find their path out of injustice, out of subjugation, and really bringing them into a space of wholeness, giving them access to opportunities in many ways that, in the ways that many African countries have failed in doing that. And so that's essentially how I got into the work. That was 7 years ago. We just celebrated our 7-year anniversary on the 8th of July. And really, really excited to have had the impact that we've had on at least 2,500 lives of young women and girls.
2,500.
Yes.
What kind of impact did your father have on you? And I'm asking you this because your father is known as the man of God who has had a lot of influence on so many people in different countries. If this man is having impact on people in faraway lands, I can only imagine the kind of impact he was having on you as his daughter.
One of the biggest lessons I learned from my dad was never allowing blind people to proofread your vision, right? He was somebody who, look, I heard from God, this is exactly what God told me, and I'm going to proceed in this way. And so he would build, he would create, he would innovate, he would iterate, and never, completely blocking out the naysayers, never really allowing outside external voices that did not align with what his vision was to affect or change the direction of what God had told him to do. And so that was a lesson that I saw embodied in him as a young woman. And it's something that I bring as well to the work that we're doing at my organization, Pathfinders.
Are you currently working primarily in Nigeria, or have you expanded in other parts of Africa?
Yeah, I mean, we're focused in Nigeria, but we work with Nigerian survivors globally. And so we, more recently, there has been a lot of human trafficking that's been happening. I think everybody's familiar with the external trafficking into Europe. But there's also been trafficking into other parts of Africa, into the Middle East. And so we have partners in 9 different countries that we're currently working with to be able to address the scourge of human trafficking, more specifically sex trafficking, which is what my organization focuses on.
Mm. And how big is the sex traffic business? I call it business because from my understanding, it generates a lot of revenue for the people who are involved. Can you put some numbers on the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just starting with the large scale picture, we know that human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. Just, from sex trafficking alone, that's about $99 billion that human traffickers are earning on an annual basis off of the bodies of human beings. The average, you can actually purchase a lifetime slave for an average of $90. And I think when it comes to the context of Nigeria, estimates indicate that there are about 1.3 million slaves within Nigeria. But to me, I don't actually believe that number is largely reported because, in the African context, we don't necessarily like to include statistics that relate to child brides, for example. We don't like to include statistics that relate to what we refer to as house help, right? So someone that you bring, a cousin, a nephew from the village, and you have them enslaved in your home working, 15, 17-hour days, not being educated, not getting the adequate nutrition, not getting enough sleep. That is a form of slavery. When we see children on the street begging, selling a tray of whatever on their heads for 10 hours, 12 hours, not being in school, That these are all forms of human trafficking. And so I think within the African context, we tend not to think of some of these things that we have normalized as part of the culture as human trafficking. We're only really thinking of women who are forced into prostitution on the streets. We're not thinking of the young child who has been sent to pay off a debt that their father owed to a rich person that they borrowed money from, or a young woman who's given as a bride in exchange of a debt that her father could not pay to, to a particular chief or something like that. So there's so many forms of trafficking that are not really included in what is the 1.3 million that's estimated within the context of Nigeria and in many other parts of Africa as well.
Yeah, that's truly heartbreaking, but also infuriating. Just to think about how these horrible injustices happen right under our nose, to be honest.
That's why we refer to human trafficking as hidden in plain sight. It's there every day, but we still consider it because it's part of what we have normalized. That's just how it is. That in many ways it's something that is so prevalent, but it's hidden in the sense that not much action to change it is actually being implemented.
I want to talk about the root causes of this problem. And the first root cause that I have found that you have highlighted was the social cultural norms of devaluing women and girls. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we tend to see in the African context and in many other places around the world, and you see this in the Middle East as well, is this idea that women are less than, right? The idea that that women are somehow less of the image, women bear less of the image and the likeness of God, right? And so as a result of that, you tend to see patriarchy, for example, being something that is injected into our laws. You see it in our customs, right? So the idea that you can have the law in Nigeria on rape, for example, being that you have to have an eyewitness, and it's or you can according to the Sharia law in the north of Nigeria, for example, you're allowed to physically discipline your wife and children as long as it doesn't result in grievous harm, right? So these are all things that are embedded into the way that we live, right, and culturally accepted, right? And so you ultimately end up with a mindset of citizens that normalize the way that women and girls are treated. And so as a result of that, you then see less opportunity. You see less funding going towards initiatives that economically empower women. You see less women in government, for example. You see less opportunities for women who are striving to be in positions of power, not pushed back into having to what we refer to as sextortion, right? Exchanging sex for an opportunity, So these are all the sort of things I think that are one of the root causes that are allowing for the proliferation of human trafficking, because then women are financially at a disadvantage, and that renders them vulnerable to traffickers.
Right. And this brings to mind the need for voices really to fight for feminism. And so when I talk about feminism, I'm not necessarily talking about copy-paste feminism from Europe or from the West, like the Eurocentric views into our communities, but we still have to find a way to reconcile our values as Africans with the value of human dignity, and particularly women's dignity. I think this is a fight that all of us Africans, including men, really, we need to be at the forefront fighting for this, because we are fighting for our sisters, our mothers, and our daughters. And I think sometimes when you think about it as something happening out there, you don't really feel connected. But when you think that it's actually your sister who could be going through this, I remember my sister was sexually abused, but we didn't know about it until she wrote it in the book some 10 years later. And then I was like, what? Are you serious? Even these barriers that are there that are preventing women from actually, speaking out and being free to speak out and knowing that she's going to be supported and empowered. So these really are social dynamics that we must change, absolutely.
Right. I mean, I think that that's, the unfortunate reality is that, using Nigeria as an example, 1 in every 4 girls is a victim of some sort of sexual violence before the age of 18. And when you look at those kind of statistics, I would, venture to say that that's, it's probably very common across the continent. And, there's a society that has shamed the voices of survivors into submission, right? So that the stigma is now on the person who has experienced this sexual violence, so that they're unable to really speak out because of the fear of either being not believed or blamed, particularly because the actual reality is that the overwhelming majority of victims of sexual violence, whether they're boys or girls, know the person who assaulted them. They're, maybe related to them in some aspect, or that person is their pastor or someone who is, well regarded within the society, or somebody who is even financially supporting the family, right? And so there's a sense of guilt in some ways of coming out to speak, because you know what the potential implications of that would be. But again, that's one of the cultural norms that we've accepted, where in addition to all of that, there's a fear that there's the victim blaming that we were accustomed to, that comes with speaking out in situations like this, and in addition to the victim shaming that we've culturally accepted as part of the unfortunate process.
Let's now talk about the second root cause, which is the policy and legislation that permit impunity to go on. So you mean in our countries we don't have strong legislations to protect women?
Right. I mean, again, just referring to the statistic that I mentioned, where 1 in 4 girls or 1 in 4 women has been a victim of some sort of sexual violence. That is rampant. I mean, that means that there's sexual assault that's happening with impunity across many parts of Africa. That means that even if you have laws in place, like most of our African countries do have laws in place, it's the implementation that's an issue. And research has made it very clear that it's the fact that people are sure that there will be a conviction that deters action, as opposed to having a strict consequence, like saying, okay, well, if you rape somebody, you will, like one of the states in Kaduna, one of our states in Nigeria, Kaduna just implemented a law where if you're found to have raped somebody, then you are automatically castrated, right? It's draconian, right, in its response, but it's not the intensity of the penalty that prevents people from actually committing the act. It's the certainty that they will be convicted, that there will be action. That is what we know deters people. So it's the implementation of the laws that are the issue.
So there's the other root cause is the lack of inclusive community awareness. Like when I look back in my life growing up as a young man, I don't remember ever being taught that women are to be honored. In fact, growing up, having as many girlfriends as possible and just bragging about your exploits, either true or false, that was like regarded as mark of being cool, being and then of course,
Right.
I grew up partly in America, where you get into the pop culture, where if you get inundated and saturated by the message from those lyrics, it's all of it is devaluing women. It's treating women as objects out there to serve you or to serve at your pleasure, to serve at your sexual pleasure. And it seems like it's actually cool. It's accepted. It's, I remember a time when we were listening to songs where being a pimp was like, wow. I mean, I didn't even know what pimp was, but I thought it was just this cool thing to be until later on. I kind of like, I'm like, wait a minute. Does it mean what I think? So there is this, I think, this culture of just hating women, and it's just so deplorable. So when I think about that, when I think about the frame of mind that I was in, and that a lot of people are in today, with regards to that, I really feel, a lot should be done from a cultural standpoint, from a societal standpoint, from a policy standpoint, in churches, everywhere, just to teach people that women are humans, and that they are regarded, they must be regarded with utmost respect and honor.
Right. I think, just to buttress your point, in Nigeria, we still have, what we refer to when people get traditionally married as bride price, right? Where you actually purchase a woman, right? By paying, bringing her family a certain number of, yams or cars or, cola nuts or whatever it is. You are giving to the family to purchase another human being, right? But again, we don't think of that as, it's just, it's culturally acceptable. It's just something that we do. But those are all the sorts of things that, you can hear a man 5-6 years later who is then physically abusive to his wife and says, she's my property, and then you have the family members saying, yes, she's your property, so you can, so these are all things that we have to start to dismantle. And that's where the really hard work comes in, because essentially what you're saying is, no, we're not trying to impose quote unquote Western values. No, we're actually just saying to you, like, let's strip this down to the bare essentials. God created man and woman at the same time, gave them the same commission, empowered them the same way. He may have formed the woman later, but when you go back to the biblical reading, man and women were created at the same time and given the same commission, given the same empowerment, but we tend to kind of forget that part, particularly for those who utilize religion as a way of subjugating women and girls. But what we're trying to do is really unravel all of that. And it's tough, difficult work, because imagine these are generations upon generations of people who have thought this way, who believe in this way. And as a result, it's culturally acceptable to have situations like this. And so what we're trying to do is really engage some of the people in the community, faith-based leaders, traditional rulers, people who have a certain level of influence, and bringing them on board to say, look, how can you use your influence to be able to help us reach some of our objectives? These are the reasons why the way that we have done it in the past have been actually harmful, to women and girls, and trying to get them on the same page as us, and then utilizing their platforms, allowing them to, be the ones who are leading in the efforts to bring about the change that we want to see, because they're the ones who people will listen to. If I come there with my, women's rights and, human rights, women's rights or human rights perspective, they may not necessarily hear things from me as well as they would from the trusted community leader or from their pastor, which is, another platform that I think is that carries a lot of influence, particularly in the Nigerian and African context.
Mm. And the other root cause that I want to talk about a little bit is the lack of economic opportunities. Girls and women who are ending up in the sex trade business, not because they want to, but because either their families are poor or them themselves are poor. How can we fix this problem?
The reality is that, poverty has been weaponized, right, in many ways. It's been utilized as a tool of oppression. and a way to marginalize other human beings, so that ultimately, when you need them, and I'm referring, when I refer to you, I'm referring to people in positions of power, right? When they need them for elections or whatever the case might be, you can actually easily manipulate their desperation. And that is something that really goes against the heart of what God's original intention was. There is no way that anybody should be living in abject poverty in the world that has so much plenty. Right. But you see that there's been a level of corruption, particularly in African context, that have utilized power and control as a way to dehumanize people. So it's not just injustice when you do certain things that result in creating vacuums or poverty. It's also just as much injustice when you fail to do things that you really should be putting in place to support people and provide basic access. I'm not talking about, world-class healthcare, basic access. No woman should ever have to look at prostitution as an alternative to poverty. You should never be in a position where you say, I have to sell my body because I'm unable to eat. And that is what we have forced a large percentage of women to have to do, and young girls to have to do. That's why you see women who are trapped in these IDP camps, in internally displaced persons camps, being forced to exchange their bodies for a meal from corrupt government officers. These are why you can see the sort of evil in our world that has taken over in many ways. And so it's again one of the things that we're working on trying to do through my organization, is by creating access, right, for young women, particularly those who have not yet even been trafficked. We certainly work with women survivors of trafficking, but through what we call the Redemption Project, we're working with women who are at risk to becoming trafficked, or women who feel like they have no alternative but to work in prostitution, and providing access to them by addressing some of those gaps that are forcing them into a position of where their vulnerabilities can ultimately be abused. But it's hard work. It takes money. It takes it takes a lot of time to really think through initiatives that are going to be successful. And again, that's why it's so important that we include the voices of survivors, because they're the ones who help us really design our initiatives, and really help us implement them as well, because they're the ones who have the lived experience. They're the ones who can tell us that this will work, this will not work, try this, don't try that, move, this is what traffickers are doing now, change your modus operandi so that you're actually staying a step ahead of the traffickers, as opposed to playing catch up.
Yeah, you just talked about how poverty has been weaponized, and that reminds me of how even sex violence itself has been used as a means of war, particularly in Eastern Congo.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you have followed the story of the Nobel Peace Prize winner Denis Mukwege from Eastern Congo.
Absolutely.
His work is just amazing. So with regards to poverty, I've heard some arguments coming specifically from prostitutes themselves, who say that prostitution should be legalized, because when it's not legalized, then it's still done, because as long as there is demand and supply, laws will not prevent transaction to happen. But they're saying it should be legalized. That way it won't be done illegally under the table. There won't be as much violence. There won't be as much abuse, because it will be legalized. People will be paying taxes on it. Now, obviously, as a believer, I don't agree with that premise. But what do you think of that argument, maybe from a legal and humanitarian point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at some of the countries where prostitution, and I prefer to refer to women who are women in prostitution, as opposed to calling them prostitutes. But what we see is that, you know, prostitution itself is really generally a choice of women who have no choice, right? So that's the overwhelming majority. It's such a small percentage of women who are in their own volition making this choice to do this with their bodies, right? And but the overwhelming majority of women are women who are doing it as a means to an end, right? We know that there's also a large percentage of women who are being trafficked who appear to be, you know, working in prostitution, right? So the day-to-day reality is that most of the, and this is research that has supported this this position, most of the women who are in prostitution would rather not be. There are statistics to support this, right? A large percentage of the women have had some sort of sexual assault. Many of them have been raped. Many of them have suffered some level of physical violence. The overwhelming majority of them are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideations, with depression. And so there's not this glamorous aspect to it, where, you know, you almost think of it as an escort service where women are empowered in some ways because they're making choices and decisions with their own bodies. And so it's a form of the women's empowerment movement. That is such a small percentage of women who are in that position. The reality for the overwhelming majority of women in prostitution is what I've just outlined. And so for me as an advocate, you know, I think, you know, women, if that's what they choose to do, it's not my, you know, initial preference, but I think, you know, my role here is to amplify the voices of women who don't have a choice, who are being forced into prostitution, who are dealing with these day-to-day implications. I mentioned the Redemption Project, which is our local initiative in Nigeria, and the overwhelming majority of women there that we've been able to support and rescue are actually in that position because they have no choice. They're not able to pay for a medication that's less than $1 to be able to heal their child of malaria. You know, they're not able to get two meals a day for their children. They're facing abject poverty, living in that, you know, below the poverty line of $1.90 a day. And so it doesn't have this glamorous outlook. And when you look at the countries that are allowing prostitution to prevail, you find some of these horrific statistics that I mentioned, and women are not empowered. On the contrary, it's actually quite disempowering for women.
I want to ask you about, we talked a little bit about victim blaming. So tell me about this. When girls report a rape, of course, there is a tendency of blaming them. You know, you called on it, the way you were dressed, or you should haven't been there. You should have done this or that or the other. So, and a lot of times it's men who are doing most of the blaming, because sometimes it's difficult to put yourself into the shoes of somebody else and see things from their perspective. But at the same time, do you think there maybe some kind of education that is needed on the part of women to teach them maybe how men think or how men operate? Because I always say, if I go to some place and then I get robbed, and if I know that if I go to that place I'm gonna get robbed, everybody who went that place got robbed. If I get robbed, I can blame the robber, but that's not gonna help my situation. I need to say, okay, what can I do so that I don't have to be in that situation again? Maybe find another route. So I'm sure you see what I'm trying to get. So what do you think about that kind of line of argument? Does that count as blaming the victim? Because I know that happens a lot, and I don't know, from the standpoint of a woman, I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, you know, I think I would be more willing to buy into that argument if there were not so many statistics that indicated that women are raped when they're fully dressed. You have nuns that have been raped. You have children that are raped in their homes by their fathers. You have situations where somebody was in a church and they were raped and assaulted. You know, the statistics that we see about rape don't necessarily support that sort of argument where, okay, the woman was dressed a certain way, or that a woman was in a position where she potentially compromised herself, or she was drinking alcohol, or whatever the situation might be. The unfortunate reality is that evil is prevalent across the globe in any particular area. And so because there are situations and so many situations where young women are assaulted regardless of what they're doing, I don't necessarily, that's always my response to that particular argument. Yes, absolutely. I think that there are things that, as young women, we should be taught, perhaps, even by our mothers or women within the community. But the reality is that is something that has not necessarily helped the situation. And so at the end of the day, you have to go back and look at the source of the problem, right? There's a quote by Martin Luther King where he says, that there's, at one point, and I'm completely paraphrasing now, but he talks about how, at some point, the man who was the Samaritan who was beaten up on the road, and had all these opportunities for people to help him, it's one thing to actually come along the way and help somebody who has fallen into hard times. But the way that you really address the problem is by making sure that nobody's ever beaten up on that road, right? Because ultimately what you're doing by telling women to dress properly, or telling them not to go to certain places, is a superficial response to a deeper underlying problem. And so that problem, unfortunately, most of the time falls on men and boys, even though we know that women are also predators at times. And so that's where the underlying problem really lies, and that's where that has to be the starting point, right? We can't just say, yes, women should do this. Sure, maybe it's helpful. But unfortunately, like I said, we've seen rape occur in situations where the woman had zero culpability, where she's in her home fully dressed, and is assaulted, by someone as well. And so that's why, we're really working to bring men on as allies, for them to be able to, I wrote a piece a few years ago called See Me, See You, and trying to get men to understand that every single time that you insult a woman, you inappropriately touch a woman, you harass a woman, you are implicitly giving permission to another man to do that to your wife, to your daughter, to your sister. And so trying to get them to see themselves in us, right? To understand that every single woman that they see bears the image and the likeness of God, right? And the fact that they have to be treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I really hate, when men, because it's usually men, although I think also some women do blame. Let's say a girl come to you and say, I've heard many stories where a daughter will come to a mother and say, this and this happened. And for whatever reason, the mom would not side with the girl. We actually blame the girl and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, which is very unfortunate, because you would think that, okay, if men are stupid, but at least the mom would know better, right?
So I think it's one thing where you have a woman go to a police, right, and the police officer, is victim blaming or victim shaming, asking her the questions like, we talked about, what were you doing there? What were you wearing? It was your fault. Or you go to a hospital and the doctor is harassing you, and then there are no rape kits, or there's nothing to actually the doctor is asking you, well, who was the eyewitness? Why were you in this place after 5 p.m.? Whatever the situation might be. That's one thing. But I think to be able to come home to a space where you're supposed to be safe, where you're supposed to be able to speak with and know that what you share will not be judged, and where you can be supported, and have the complete opposite of that happen. It's totally devastating for young women when they're in these situations. And I think a lot of the reasons why you see a lot of mothers do that is not only are they dealing with their own trauma sometimes, and dealing with a situation where they were not heard or given voice. They're also dealing with the reality that usually, because the person who committed this assault is someone that they know, according to statistics, that person may be a source of financial support for the family, or they may be someone who is in a position of power and who they believe will not will ultimately get away with the assault. There's also the reality that society has indicated has taken a posture that someone who's been sexually assaulted does not have the value of what God initially intended, right? And so there's this idea that the mother wants to, quote unquote, protect the daughter so that she is still marriageable in the future, because if she's known as someone who was sexually assaulted, she may no longer have the value. And so one of the things I tend to do when we're speaking and engaging young women and girls is I will usually take $100 bill or whatever the largest denomination is in the country where I am, and I will crumble it, and I will step on it, throw it on the ground, I'll throw it in the air, and then I will pick it up and unravel it, and I will ask everybody in the group, how many of you would still want this $100 bill? And everybody still raises their hands, right? Because the value of the $100 bill doesn't change, right? And so that's one of the examples I use with young women, and I say your value doesn't change in spite of this thing that has happened to you, in spite of the fact that you were not believed, in spite of the fact that nobody validated the reality of what has happened. Your value has not changed.
As you do your work, are you encountering resistance or support from the local authorities? What's the relationship between your organization and the authorities?
Yeah, it's a complicated one because to a certain extent, government are really the people who are in a position to scale the kind of interventions that we're implementing, that we're seeing as successful. But a lot of times there is not the necessary prioritization of these particular issues. There is, like I mentioned, if you have a situation where 1 in 4 women in your community has been victimized, there's clearly a lack of implementation of laws or the reality that people are able to rape with impunity, right? They're able to get away with it. And so they know that there are no consequences for this. And so, so part of it is frustrating in the sense that lack of prioritization ultimately results in underfunded initiatives within the community, right? So you tend to see situations where, you can report a rape case and nothing ever happens from it, where you go to a police station and the police will be asking you for money to mobilize. That in and of itself, I think, is very frustrating. And so, financially, the money definitely doesn't trickle down to NGOs who are actually doing the work that government should be doing. We have never been funded by any Nigerian agency at all. I mean, on the contrary, what we've had to do is create partnerships with them so that we bring the funding, we bring the support, and then they partner with us to use their platform to be able to reach more people. And so that's really the medium that I've been able to find that's been able to help us to scale some of our activities, because we're not going to get the financial support from government, either because they're just the issue itself is not a priority for their leadership or the legislature or the executive or whoever it is. And so as a result of that, there's not the necessary funding to be able to address many of these societal ills.
Right. But, you would think that even without, let's say, funds available from the government or for the government to be able to do these things, you would think that at least mobilizing people on the ground, especially men, really, because men are the ones who are doing most of those crimes, having a situation where men are taught, young men, where older men are stepping up and saying, hey, it may be happening there or there or there, but this nonsense is not happening here. So it looks like there is a lack of responsibility, lack of leadership from this, like from a societal standpoint, from community standpoint. I mean, I would think that if there is a small community, if 10 or 20 men will just stand and say, look, in this place, we are not allowing this to happen. And if you dare go that route, you are going to have steep consequences. I mean, there should be some kind of really homegrown indigenous effort to stand for, for our sisters and our mothers. And the reason why I say that, there is one, let me tell you this story, something that I will never forget. I was about, I think, 13 years old in Kenya, and I was a refugee in that country. And as a refugee, of course, you have to be very careful. I was in a place which was not very safe. But so there was this young lady who had been harassed. She was in a taxi. She was being harassed by a man in that taxi, and the woman was shouting, "Leave me alone! Stop touching me!" This and that and the other, and everybody was just acting as if nothing was going on. People were just not intervening. And then this woman, she gets upset. She gets out of the taxi. That the man, clearly you could see that the man was like a thug. So people were maybe afraid of that guy. You could see that he was under some kind of influence. He just started running after this lady. The lady took up a rock and they hit him, and the lady was crying out, "Help me! He wants to hurt me, rape me!" But the guy was just like an animal, and the girl ran away. The guy ran after him, and then it was kind of like, it was like a poor area, so it's not like very lit, like no street lights, nothing. And but there was a crowd, but nobody in the crowd. There were men, women, so many people. Nobody in the crowd dared say, "Hey." So every time that image has never left my mind.
It's one of these things where there is the phenomenon, right, that it's referred to, where you have bystanders that can literally watch something happen, but because one person fails to step forward, everybody just stays in the background. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because all it really takes is just one person to step out, and then somebody else gets the courage to step out, and then and then it continues like that. But I think again it all goes back to sort of some of our societal norms and what we've accepted to be okay, particularly when they're happening to the bodies of women and girls. And that's why, as you said earlier, we see rape, for example, being utilized as a weapon of war.
Yeah. So if people wanted to join the fight, do you have any way of maybe accepting people's inputs, or is there any way people can join you in your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this is something that everybody can contribute to. Everyone from a lawyer to a graphic designer to to an accountant. I mean, there are all these skills that people can bring to be able to support the work. And so we have a very active volunteer community that we are growing. I think we're, probably about 300 volunteers at this point in time, but they're the ones who really help us, really scale the work that we're doing, because our team is relatively small. There's, less than 10 of us that are actually doing the work on a day-to-day basis. And so we always welcome volunteers, people who are willing to delve into the cause, and not on a superficial level. I mean, we want people who really have who this work actually resonates with in some way. Like it's this kind of thing that keeps you up at night, like, that has you pondering situations that you've witnessed, and wanting to right injustice that you see happening. And really asking yourself, what your why is. Why am I interested in this cause? What is the underlying aspect of it that really bothers me about the way that society has normalized some of these evils? And so I think we're specifically looking for people that have that level of engagement, and they're not just looking at this as a way of what we refer to as volunteerism, right? So where you leave your country to come and help poor African women, and you get your photo up and you post it on your Instagram. Like those aren't things that, we're looking for people who are really engaged in the subject matter itself, and are in it for the long haul, because this is not something that we're going to be able to eradicate overnight. When we talk about addressing root causes, it really requires a level of intentionality as well. So it's not just, certainly people are welcome to volunteer, but none of this work can be done without money. That's just the truth of what we're having to face. I mean, every year we provide support for a minimum of 100 survivors of sex trafficking. We're also, in addition to that, providing support for women who have been sexually violated. We're providing trainings. We have adult education classes that are open to the community, where we teach people who are not in formal education the basics of reading and writing. Like all of this stuff, to be able to do any of this costs money, and so people can certainly donate their funds to support the work, as well as actually volunteering your time or your services.
Right. Thank you very much. And of course, your website has plenty of information. I like the posters behind you, especially the one that says, "People are not for sale, and human trafficking now." Miss Idahosa, thank you very much for allowing us to have this conversation, and the work that you are doing. We really pray for success, and we are cheering for you and for your team. We are fighting together, and let's just continue to make Africa great again.